Okay, cool. All right, so yeah, welcome everyone to the LSE chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society. If you are new to this organization, I'll send some links in the chat to platypus1917.org. We are an organization that looks at the history of the left and are trying to view the symptomology of what we call the dead left through reading group activities, teach-ins, the Platypus Review, which is a monthly publication, and a host of other public events that we do. So I think well, LSE, we have a reading group every Wednesday at 6 p.m. In the UK. And every Friday we have a discussion group, what we call coffee break, at 5 p.m. So if any of you would like to get more involved in those events, message me or message Facebook LSE Platypus page, and we'll try to get you involved. So I think I'll hand over to Dominic, who will be treating us to a lecture on Nietzsche.
Teaching. Right, so thank you all for coming to listen to my my thoughts. I've been studying him quite closely recently with a mentor, Lewis Haling, who's based in Austin. So I'm really thankful for all the work he's put into helping me think through Nietzsche. And I also wanted to thank Ephraim for looking through an early draft of this teaching. Of course, like, neither of them are responsible for the product that I'm about to read. So I'll begin now and just get on with it. Well, sorry, did someone say something? No? Okay.
Yeah, Ephraim said shout out.
Oh, okay. What I wanted to do with this teaching is introduce newer members, contacts, and milieu to the Nietzsche that they never had a chance to read. You may already be acquainted with him in some manner or another, but if, like me, you found yourself around Platypus sometime after 2016, you won't have found much Nietzsche on the syllabus. 2 weeks of the preliminary reading group, Radical Bourgeois Philosophy, were once dedicated to him, in which 2 of his essays were discussed. They were on the use and abuse of history for life and on the genealogy of morals. These weeks were replaced with a reading of Adam Smith's Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations. So the latest iteration of this reading group is comprised of Rousseau, Adam Smith, Benjamin Constant, Kant, and Hegel. All these philosophers predate the 1840s. What unites them is their recognition of freedom in society, that dialectical social relations pointed beyond the present. Kant recognized a relation between public and private reason, wherein people undertook work as technicians, but also reflected as citizens on how things might be different. Adam Smith, too, had noticed that the exchange of particulars had a dynamic over and above it, which increased the general wealth of all. They saw the possibility of what could and should be unfolding in what already was. In their company, it might appear that Friedrich Nietzsche sticks out like a sore thumb, if for no other reason than his melancholia. But we shouldn't look at his disposition as an accidental quirk, but more as a function of his time. Nietzsche was born in 1844, in the Hungry 40s, a decade characterized by the manifestation of an unprecedented crisis following the Industrial Revolution. Famine, debt, proletarianization, and mass unemployment spurred revolutionary sentiment, which broke out in 1848. Marx dedicated his Communist Manifesto to these revolutions. Their failure, however, consolidated this crisis politically with the rise of the authoritarian state. A formative moment of Nietzsche's life was the 1870 Franco-Prussian War, the ascendancy of Bismarck, and German nationalism. He considered his meditations untimely because they were critical of Germany at the peak of its self-aggrandizement. What had happened in the 19th century was a crisis of the social relations that had once been recognized as a dialectic of freedom. Society now appeared to undermine freedom. Nietzsche's philosophy pertains to the age of society's massification in a way that early radical bourgeois philosophers' work did not. He is therefore a creature of capitalism. There is a discontinuity between the radical bourgeois philosophers that remain on the syllabus and Friedrich Nietzsche. He shares his moment with Marx, and both were critics of what society had become in the 19th century. So keeping this historical juncture in mind, it's also clear that there's continuity. Rousseau, Adam Smith, Benjamin Constant, Kant and Hegel, but also Marx and Nietzsche are all concerned with freedom, whether it's fulfilling or undermining itself. This concern with freedom is actually the mark of the left. Historically, in relation to politics, the left sought to negate the conditions of the present in such a way that approached its desired utopia. The right considers such things impossible and dangerous, preferring to affirm the present as the best of all possible worlds. It is difficult to read Nietzsche as affirmative of the present, and if I'm to emphasize one aspect of his work, the aspect that ties him into the red thread of the Platypus syllabus, it is that he's a philosopher of freedom, a critic of the present who wished for us to go beyond it. He therefore stands in relation to the left. Writing on the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche equated the will to power with the instinct for freedom. Incidentally, this is something that Michel Foucault disposed of in his reworking of Nietzschean history. Nietzsche understood life as such to be a manifestation of this will to power, even from an evolutionary standpoint, as against the English Darwinians, who framed biological history as a story of passive adaptation. Their prejudice, as Nietzsche put it, prevented them from seeing the activity of life. They obscured the will to power, which was not only a mastery of circumstance, but a mastery of the self. In the best cases, it entails putting something old to new use. In other words, it entails self-transformation. But biology is besides the point, and it opens up questions I'm not qualified to answer. Ignorance of the will to power has greater significance for society and history than it does for Darwinism. The genealogists of morals, and Nietzsche was not one of them, are in such ignorance. They saw the present as the culmination and development of a lineage. European bourgeois society is the inheritor of Greece, Rome, and Judea, a progress of ideals. Nietzsche's essay is on the genealogy of morals. It's an essay about this way of relating to the passage of time as something progressive, and it's about the dangers this view entails. The genealogists use the past to explain the function of things in the present. Thus, from this perspective, the history of the moral value of the good is the history of the development of modern utilitarianism. A genealogist might say in self-congratulation, good things must always have been useful, and today we're more useful than ever. But Nietzsche reckoned that the genealogists of morals are worthless. As a classical philologist by profession, he'd been studying and comparing the meaning of language across cultures and ages, and therefore had insight into the radical reversals of values that had taken place in history. He begins on the genealogy of morals by counterposing two value systems, good and bad, and good and evil. These two valuations don't represent the moral habitus or build of an individual, but the form of society one lives in. There is a historical relation between the two. The world of good and evil, that of the sick and priestly peoples, had decidedly won out against the warrior aristocracies that valued the good life of revelry and health. Greece, the Goths, and even Rome had fallen before Christendom. This victory was the slave revolt of morality. The victorious, but sick and enslaved, too weak to avenge themselves and dizzy with resentment, found refuge in this valuation. The new good, the last who shall be first into heaven, were defined against the new evil. This new evil was that which was once considered good, the beastly strength and health of the barbarian. This transvaluation goes unnoticed by the genealogists. From their point of view, the present had descended from Greece and Judea. They were sat atop an ever-growing heap of the good, a quantitative refinement of virtue. They did not see the qualitative change. They did not see the destructive triumph of Christianity, that if a temple is to be erected, a temple must be destroyed. Nietzsche's correction of this genealogical error comprises the content of the first two essays on the genealogy of morals. It's a demonstration of how morality hasn't progressively improved, but has instead undergone radical transformations. But the third essay poses a different question, which is, how might a radical transformation happen again? This question was important because the genealogists had not only obscured the history of human self-transformation, but they had also obscured the most recent of all transformations, the waning of the Christian metaphysic and the overthrowing of traditional society. This is to say, Nietzsche thought that we had already begun to transform again. We could date the beginning of this process to the Protestant Reformation. We're talking about the Renaissance, the rise of towns, commerce, the exchange of labor and public reason. In other words, we're talking about the bourgeois revolution of society. The problem, as Nietzsche saw it, was that we had not confronted this fact fully and self-consciously. But let's back up. The priests, scholars, and philosophers of traditional society were reflecting on a religious metaphysic. In a truly religious society, there's a unity of the true, the good, and the beautiful. There's a divine identity of God and his plan. But modern society is different. There is no ordained plan or sense of circularity. As it's put by Louis Menand, who's a staple on the Platypus syllabus, in modern societies, the idea is not to repeat, but to change, and meaning is no longer immanent in the practices of ordinary life. Tilling your lot isn't seen as part of God's plan. Rather, for moderns, it's important to take up a trade, specialize your labor, and take your wares to market. There is nothing less than a major transvaluation of values here. And it's in response to these developments that moral philosophers like Adam Smith recognize a labor theory of value. Labor and its exchange as social relations mediate the true and the good. It mediates what is around and what should be around. The process of making the good true is the modern, perpetually unfolding bourgeois concept of freedom. So why has Nietzsche got a headache over this? It's a radically open-ended understanding of a radical society. So what's the problem? The problem is the historical juncture we talked about earlier. Marx might say that by the time Nietzsche was writing, the social relations of labor were in self-contradiction. Dead labor opposed living labor. This laboring society had developed machinery, science, or capital that undermined the basis of its value. This emancipation appeared very sick indeed. Freedom in society was not only dysfunctional but self-defeating. The mediation that was supposed to make the good true disintegrated. From Nietzsche's perspective, moderns had never resolved the catastrophic loss of meaning that came with the death of God. He thought the social relations of labor were just one of many failed attempts to avoid the big question of human values. He thought labor was merely the Protestant ethic of mechanical work. So here is a clear departure of Nietzsche from Marx in terms of objective critique. They were actually both critics of socialism as a 19th century political expression of this demand that labor be valued. Marx pursued it as a high expression of contradiction, with the very Hegelian understanding that if labor's value were to be fulfilled in social revolution, it would also overcome and negate itself. But Nietzsche did not pursue this. His critique remained more firmly in what could be called the realm of ideology. One of Nietzsche's core insights is that to suffer in the face of meaninglessness is intolerable. And this was the origin of the good and evil valuation to begin with. The slave people wouldn't have been able to tolerate the injustices of their miserable lives if they hadn't have believed in Judgment Day, that the brutes would get what's coming to them. But in light of losing this value system, this Christian metaphysic, moderns remained in a state of meaninglessness and had to find other ways to look away from the question of what is good and whether we have it. The Protestant ethic is one such way, according to Nietzsche. But he, in terms of his critique, aimed a bit higher and took issue with the very production of knowledge in modern society. Nietzsche had noticed that science and philosophy was making no effort to relate the categories of the true and the good. It had instead made a virtue out of their separation. All things and all questions, lively and bodily, were being denied. Scientists would try their hardest to eradicate any consideration of the good. In other words, in trying to understand the world and our place in it, they sought to expunge human desire and striving from the question. They content themselves with the accumulation of small facts, mountains upon mountains of them. The less interpretation and the less interest the gatherer, the better. Nietzsche considered this a continuation of the aesthetic ideal, that which was practiced by the monks of traditional society. It's a conscious refusal to make judgments about what might be good. But what this refusal cannot see is that it is a judgment all the same. Mankind's will to power has been obscured, but not totally. Nietzsche ends on the genealogy of morals with this note, that man would rather will nothingness than not will at all. This is a plea for self-consciousness. Even as the aesthetic moderns strive to accumulate the small facts and avoid the task of creating new values, they value in their striving. They are making a judgment about what is good while trying to avoid it. There is a self-contradiction here that Nietzsche hopes will burst asunder in the aestheticism of moderns. Confronted with the growth of their meaningless product, their little facts, they cannot avoid the painful confrontation with meaninglessness. A confrontation Nietzsche thinks would do nothing but pose the important question of what could and should we value on a self-conscious level. He is hoping that we will be forced to re-relate the question of what is true with what is good. He hopes that us moderns, living our meaningless existence, can overcome ourselves and create new values instead of endless little facts. In other words, he hopes that mankind can own up to its will to power, its instinct for freedom, so that it can transform itself fully and not be left in this halfway state, half animal, half angel, as he put it. He sees a way out within, but because he is immanent with his object, he is often mistaken as an apologist for nihilism, advocating an embrace of meaninglessness. This reading is wrong. We might begin to see similarities between Nietzsche and Marx again, especially in their philosophical inheritance. Nietzsche, like Marx, is undertaking an immanent critique. He is also, like Marx, anticipating a self-overcoming of his object. Nietzsche shares a great deal more with German idealism than he lets on. Far from being anti-science or a radical relativist, he had fully reconciled himself to the cause of objective scholarship. But he took on objectivity or objective truth in the sense that it's a social relation. He wrote the following in a fragment called On Truth and Lie in an Extra-Moral Sense. Quote, "Truth is a sum of human relations, which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that this is what they are, metaphors which are worn out and without sensuous power, coins which have lost their pictures and now matter only as metal, no longer as coins." So that truth is an illusion does not make it untrue. In the same way that despite objectivity being an achievement of the subject, it is still objective. For Nietzsche and German idealism, truth is not a passive reception of facts, but a creative action. It's an organization and relation of material. The subject transforms things into objects. The aesthetic moderns, of course, have abdicated the task of creating truth in a meaningful sense in favor of the small facts. But it's clear that upon reading Nietzsche, that he has very few good things to say about Kant and Hegel. But what Nietzsche is criticizing is what became of these philosophers in the 19th century. Their thought was not suitable for Nietzsche's time. And those who tried to transplant bourgeois philosophy in the age of bourgeois crisis were reaching absurd conclusions. Hegelianism, which had captivated German philosophy, expressed this flagrantly. Where Hegel's thought had once been a revolutionary consciousness of freedom in history, Hegelianism deified the facts, affirmed the present, and celebrated everything that came into being, including the authoritarian state, German nationalism, and anti-Semitism. Critical philosophy became affirmative. Nietzsche was critiquing the ossification of German idealism, especially as it manifested in the young Hegelians. Once again, just like Marx. At this point, it's crucial to talk about the concept of history. This is what has been most profoundly corrupted in the Hegelians. Nietzsche's earlier essay on the use and abuse of history for life provides a similar critique of the present as on the genealogy of morals. That is, a critique of the crisis of bourgeois society and its self-knowledge. And much like the latter essay, a lot can be learned from the title alone. Nietzsche is critiquing the practice of history as a potential service or disservice to life. Do we do history in order to live and change? Or do we exclude the question of living and find in history nothing but 1,000 reasons why the present is the way it is? In mid to late 19th century Germany, the prevailing form of history was what Nietzsche called antiquarian. It's the activity of the archivist who collects every fact about the past. While not bad in of itself, by then it had become deadly. Nietzsche wrote that through the demand that history was to be a science of universal becoming, the service of history for life had been altered. In this new science of history, this historicism, the facts appeared as the cause of a predetermined present. Knowledge determined life at the expense of the will. There is no instinct for freedom, only a consideration of what is already in existence. In other words, there is nothing critical about this thinking. It's affirmative. Here's another quote from Nietzsche. "Arrogant European of the 19th century, you are raving. Your knowledge does not complete nature, but only kills your own. For once, measure your height as a knower against your depth as a person who can do something. Of course, you clamber on the solar rays of knowledge upwards towards heaven, but you also climb downwards to chaos." Nietzsche had hoped, again imminently, that the sheer pressure one feels under the weight of this antiquarian history would produce the need to condemn and destroy it. He wanted the historical sense to become suprahistorical. That is to say that he recognized the necessity of critical history, the act of judging the past so that the present may disown it and depart from it. To illustrate this, Nietzsche has a great example of distinguishing between a good and a bad biography. A good biography would place the historical figure as someone against his time, not of his time, someone who changed history instead of continuing it. The question of what about the course of history should be changed is central to critical history. When Marx proclaimed that the history of mankind is a history of class struggles, he was specifying exactly which aspect of history he had hoped the proletarian revolution would change and put an end to, namely exploitation. The task of grasping history was understood by both Marx and Nietzsche to be an essential requirement of any attempt to overcome the ever same in the present. Nietzsche himself, however, despite recognizing its need, never formulated a complete critical history. So what use is Nietzsche? Nietzsche had identified a pervasive ideological effect on consciousness that takes place in capitalism, in which death looms over life and history looms over the present. This diagnosis sees life as suffering from itself, from a misrecognition of what it is. Everything that has solidified and become objective overwhelms and appears to determine the subject. Marx's concept of capital can be seen in exactly the same way. Capital, which is nothing but ossified labor, looms over living labor. Marx's dialectical method was an attempt to clarify the theory and practice of a politics that could overcome this process. But Marxism succumbed to it. And if you're around Platypus for this term's reading group, you'll be going through the introduction to revolutionary Marxism. You'll come up against the revisionist dispute, in which Marxism fell into crisis and exhibited the ideological consciousness diagnosed by Nietzsche. The revisionists like Edward Bernstein no longer felt the need to judge history critically and instead took progress for granted. Socialism appeared to be on its way naturally within capitalism. This was an idea that socialism was inevitable and that history ploughed onwards according to laws of necessity. It found expression later in Stalinist historical materialism. Like Hegelianism in the 19th century, Marxism had become an affirmative justification for the present in the 20th century through its crisis. What looks and feels like progress is actually regression. This is all very important for the Frankfurt School, which conclude at the other end the introduction to revolutionary Marxism as a syllabus. The Frankfurt School tried to deal with this ossification of Marxism and the loss of a critical consciousness of freedom in history. Walter Benjamin in particular, in his thesis on history, owes a lot to Nietzsche. He gives critical history a twist, whereas instead of the present stepping outside of history in a super historical fashion to judge and condemn it, Benjamin wished for us to feel the past as a judgment of the present. But that will come later if you stick around LSE, or which other chapters are here for this reading group. As a final consideration, I want to bring back the problem of the left. Nietzsche was not a leftist, but he does stand in relation to the left because of his recognition of bourgeois society's crisis. That crisis is a crisis of freedom and its possibility. Nietzsche wanted us to go beyond our current condition. He called it sick in the sense that pregnancy is a sickness, that new life is waiting to be brought into being. Things are bad, but the badness indicates a possibility of something new and perhaps good. So what does it mean that the contemporary left often reads Nietzsche as a reactionary? It might indicate that the task of freedom in history has been further obscured and rendered illegible. The will to power, which was always the instinct for freedom and self-transformation, is often seen today as the motive force behind domination, and much of the left would rather will it into nothingness. There is a palpable sense of weariness, shame, and self-loathing for humanity, and perhaps many feel that it would have been best if we'd never evolved and become human at all. Today, nihilism is rife, and Nietzsche's assertion of the will to power is found repulsive. That's all from my teaching. Thank you all very much for listening to my reflections there. We'll have a Q&A, or if you have questions, pipe up, say your piece, or if you have a comment also, feel free.
Yeah, so you can raise your hand or you can submit a question in the chat if you like. We've got Danny immediately in there with a hand. Danny, do you want to put your comment or question?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to bring out, and actually I thought you brought on, brought this up, Dom, as well, which was great, which is the closer relationship between Marx and Nietzsche than is often drawn parallels with. So I was thinking of two things that came to mind. One of them is Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil. He calls democracy industrializing, meaning it's kind of breaking people down into equal, right? Like something that would have been a bourgeois desiderata, equality before the law, the end of caste privilege. Now we experience as a kind of industrializing, like a homogenous, and this is his herd thing. Mm-hmm. And then Marx says actually the same thing about Proudhon. So in a sense, actually the original critique of socialism by Marx, Nietzsche ends up repeating it in his own way in Beyond Good and Evil and in Genealogy of Morals. And I was wondering if you could talk about that. So for example, with Proudhon, he says, well, Proudhon, you have this desiderata of equality. And Marx says, isn't that what the capitalist factory does? It equalizes everybody. Right? In other words, this socialist desiderata is something that comes out of the capitalist factory and is maybe not against capitalism, but maybe the highest expression. So I was wondering if you could talk about that in terms of the aesthetic ideals.
Right. It's difficult to speak to it as something, I guess, specific to capitalism. Because the way I understand it is, I actually haven't read much of Nietzsche's critique of socialism. I know he also wrote something where he basically likened it to, I think he called it the tyranny of the mediocre in one essay. So the way I understand this is that Nietzsche understood socialism to be kind of a very high expression of this desire to be a community, to be a herd, a kind of resentful herd. It is kind of like a high expression of ressentiment. And in this sense, it might not actually be untrue. It might be very true that socialism is in a large, like in every revolt, in recent history in the last couple of hundred years, resentment might be one of the primary motivating factors of it. And very often this doesn't actually go beyond the present at all.
Sure.
It is just a kind of sense, it's a revenge, and it does reconstitute the conditions of the present. So I don't think this is even a particular problem for Marxism and socialist revolution. I mean, it doesn't particularly matter necessarily what energies are being channeled into it, because the kind of the form it takes in socialism, you know, in push, as Marx understood it, as pushing the self-contradiction of labor as value, it does point somewhere else in a way that, you know, resentment alone doesn't. I don't know if that speaks to what you were asking.
No, no, I think it does in that sense. In other words, if Marx didn't have that critique of political economy, as you brought up, in a sense, maybe he just would be Nietzschean. He would just be like, look, this is just some kind of anti. Does that make any sense in it? Like, yes. I'm trying to get at how what Nietzsche is missing is not that Nietzsche's an elitist and Marx is like for the people, but in a sense, it would have been interesting if you could have Marx and Nietzsche in the room and you could get them from maybe not fighting each other. You know, maybe they're difficult personally, but get them to go, actually, look, you guys are saying something very similar. And that says something about Marx's critique of socialism, that it's not that it was like a bleeding heartism, but actually he was aware of the fact that there is a resentment. You know, we read the 1844 manuscripts and he says, is not communism driven by the same avarice and greed? Perhaps it might be, like, you know, it's not like everyone has to be an angel, and that is very unlikely. It's rather, what is the possibility and such? And I guess that's what you just said. So I just wanted to make that sort of half comment, half question, but it looks like Ethan has a question.
Hi, Ethan.
I mean, that's a very good point. Yep. Do we have to spotlight me at this point for the Q&A?
Ethan's requested it, unfortunately. So
no, I meant requested it for the video. It's too late now.
It's too late.
I can't see people's faces. Could you?
Oh, that's actually, that is very fair. That's very fair.
Yeah, I like the community style Q&A.
The herd.
Except you're our shepherd this time.
Okay,
well, so while Rebecca's working on the presenter view thing, first of all, Dom, I loved your teaching.
Thank you.
Before the recording started, we were chatting for a minute about how you have just recently come to Nietzsche, and you were you used to be put off by him, and I don't think you're alone in that. I think his reception is what it is for you know, a variety of reasons. My question is sort of in asking about that. I actually have an analogy to how we read Rousseau against the grain, just like we try to read Nietzsche against the grain. So the way Rousseau is remembered today, you know, is as this like anti-society, go backwards kind of, we've gotten it all wrong, and we have to go backwards to a simpler time. And of course, that's, you know, when you take a closer look at what he's actually saying, that's not, he's more ambiguous than that. He's saying, you know, freedom is actually a task. You can run from it or you can take it up. I find that, you know, when I'm bringing Nietzsche to students, they find him really indigestible. They've objected to that pregnancy metaphor that you brought up, because, you know, pregnancy only takes 9 months. But if humanity is pregnant, then it's been going on a lot longer than 9 months. It's been going on a long time, and it seems to be going nowhere. And so, you know, any potential that they point to it's just hard for people to think about. So I wanted to open that up. Is what did you think of Nietzsche before you know, Platypus introduced you to him, and why do you think people are returning to Nietzsche in that way?
Well, before I came to him in Platypus, again, we talked about it before, I didn't have a particularly sophisticated reason to dislike him. It was my experience that people would turn to Nietzsche away from Marx. I kind of experienced it as people kind of running from the challenge of politics. But as it stands in Platypus, the first time I started reading Nietzsche through Platypus, my education was cut short. Like, I only was able to make it for half the reading group. And I really did I brought a lot of prejudice into the reading. I really did. I read it almost through the events of the 20th century. You know, it is his rhetoric is very abrasive and provocative, and it's not politically correct at all. And from our point of view, so I read it absolutely through fascism. Talking about the Jewish people, talking about the cunning, and talking about the master race. So this is a significant obstacle to actually reading Nietzsche. We can't help but do it. Well, we can if we take it very seriously and we read very closely. But I think also, as we mentioned before this teaching began, there is this problem of his later posthumous works, like The Will to Power, which were edited to the extent that they perhaps misrepresent what he was meaning. But I don't know a huge amount about that. I feel like there was another part of your question, kind of about the pregnancy, and about the kind of like, in relation to Rousseau, there's kind of like this ambivalent relationship to modernity. Like, it's either, was it worth it or not? Are we going to make good on the suffering? Is the pregnancy going to be borne out? I think this is actually interesting, and it kind of is related to what Danny brought up with the critique of political economy, in the sense that it's actually kind of helpful for us that Nietzsche doesn't have a critique of political economy, and he doesn't, throw in all of his energy with the socialists and with Marxism, because Marxism did fall into crisis seemingly irrecoverably. So actually, the fact that Nietzsche didn't read history as the history of class struggles, and the fact that he didn't see the socialist movement as perhaps the combination of this that put an end to it, gives us another really valuable perspective on the history of humanity, and where it could perhaps be going, just in view of perhaps, the failure of Marxism. That's what I have to say there. I hope that wasn't too rambly or unclear.
Anybody else? If you can unmute and jump in or raise your hands.
Or just any comments, if anyone wants to like really talk about Nietzsche and say their piece.
Oh, Tom, hi. Can I help?
Hey, yes, hi. I wanted to ask about postmodernism. I mean, sort of Nietzsche seems, from the point of view of an old fogey like myself, Nietzsche seems to be all the rage among the postmodernists, and I wondered how your reaction to Nietzsche corresponded to reaction to postmodernism, and this idea that the idea that I've heard from Platypus that postmodernism may be true but is somehow premature.
Right. Thank you very much. Now, what's interesting is I think it's actually on the syllabus, or at least like the most recent syllabi for Nietzsche. We kind of run like short, like winter reading groups, perhaps on Nietzsche. I was just in one with Victor, and part of the reading group is the BBC's documentaries All Too Human, and it goes from Nietzsche to Heidegger to Sartre. And I accidentally was watching the Heidegger one before I realized. I think this is perhaps the route that Nietzsche goes through to get to postmodernism. Yeah, I don't know a huge amount, and I don't know if I want to get too bogged down in it. But what I tried to draw out in this teaching was I mentioned briefly Foucault. I don't know with what right I have to call him a postmodernist. I mean, I don't really know of anyone who owns up to being called a postmodernist, but with Foucault, he takes up this idea of the will to power, and of course he was a massive fan of Nietzsche. I've read this anecdote of him reading Nietzsche on the beach, and his life was changed forever. He's a big fan of Nietzsche, and reading Foucault, you can definitely tell he's rewriting a lot of Nietzsche, but absolutely nothing to do with this instinct for freedom that Nietzsche is quite clear about. that he equates in his book. So that question of there being kind of a challenge, a kind of a struggle, is perhaps lost in postmodernism, and it becomes much more about kind of relatively different arrangements of power, rather than the task of creating something new and good. It becomes how can we examine these different constellations of power. I think Foucault said that it's not a question of creating a new and better world. It's a question of more or less authoritarianism or something. Sorry, I'm trying to remember the last part of your question. What was the last part? Sorry, Tom, I don't know if you're still there. It's just the last part I was a little bit confused about. I'm trying to remember.
Sorry, I muted myself. It was basically about how our reaction to Nietzsche should be mediated, should be affected, or something, by our reaction to postmodernism, and I guess I would like to also sort of bring in the whole question of nihilism in here, because I think nihilism is normally a charge, right? Sort of like if somebody accuses you of being a nihilist, that generally is seen to be as something bad. Then you look at like Marx's letter, like where he calls for the ruthless critique of everything, which sort of seems a little bit nihilistic, and you sort of I was sort of very interested in the recent exchange about philosophy in the Platypus Review, and it seems to me that Chris Cratone's sort of desire to basically abolish philosophy would be seen by some as being nihilistic, and I'm wondering what this sort of this is another point, but to what extent nihilism is actually seen as being as a reaching out to freedom in the context of unfreedom, and whether basically the philosophical current that we're sort of examining actually calls for something of a reevaluation of what we think of nihilism.
Okay, as you were speaking also, you reminded me of what you said before at the end of your previous question. So I just maybe wanted to say something about that just before. When you said, there's this idea that we read Moishe Postone in Platypus, and he has this idea that postmodernism is premature post-capitalism. And I think perhaps that is what you were talking about when you mentioned that perhaps perhaps postmodernism is right, but only after a revolution or something like that. And I guess I've been thinking about this, and I believe my thoughts here are related. In Ethan's article on Nietzsche, and I think perhaps in Slanit's as well, there's this idea. Actually, no, sorry, this comes from the Frankfurt School. There's this idea that until Marx is proven right, he's currently wrong, he's currently falsified, and it's a task to show that Marx was right in any capacity. Until Marx is right, Nietzsche is also right, or like he stands true while Nietzsche, sorry, I'm mixing up my words. Nietzsche stands true while Marx looks false. So there's this idea that, we do live in this we do have this ideological problem of willing nothingness in capitalism. But the way I understand it also is if labor as value is overcome, as I mentioned, self-overcome and negated by a social revolution, for the first time, it actually becomes possible to ask what else could humanity value, in a free sense, because in a way, the valorization of labor in capitalism and the value system is something that looms over us and determines us, or at least it appears to. And only when that is overcome could it be posed more clearly, like actually, what do we value that isn't work? So perhaps in that sense, you know, postmodernism is kind of, you know, being able to pose the question of what matters to you, perhaps as an individual, not as a system, would matter more. Sorry, I don't know if that answers your question, or if anyone else wants to come in on this point.
I was going to add just one small thing that, I mean, you can talk about the really vacuous, like post-structural stuff with Sarah Kaufman and just taking one passage of Nietzsche and writing 300 pages about his word usage and dropping all the real context. But what the more interesting parts of postmodernism take up in Nietzsche is the seeming criticism of all grand narratives and his seeming rejection of Hegel and his overturning of the Enlightenment. But where they write the final chapter on it, where postmodernism says all of that was wrong, Nietzsche is not so willing to say that, you know, the end of the story is written. He's saying, you know, it's like, there's the other metaphor of the caterpillar. How the caterpillar is, you know, in a chrysalis and then it blossoms into a butterfly, and it's like nasty and yucky and it's an ugly process, but at the end it's this beautiful liberated being. I think Nietzsche is still saying that we haven't figured out the end of what all of that process was. There's still potential left in it, whereas postmodernism would sort of want to write it all off.
Rory, what did you want to come in with?
I thought maybe one way of getting at this relationship between Nietzsche and Marx, but also Nietzsche and postmodernism, is the relationship of Nietzsche to modernism, right? So, like, and I'm glad that Rousseau was brought up, because there's, you know, he's kind of emblematic, like certainly for us in Platypus, of a kind of, you know, of a kind of 18th century conception of change and the meaning of change, and you know, how kind of like categories of like freedom and, you know, nature are kind of to be related. I mean, there's also the Kant line about nature having a plan for humanity, and the plan is freedom. The plan is to be free. So there's this sense of a kind of constitutive relationship between how change happens and, you know, the absolute, so to speak, or like the kind of goal of freedom. And, you know, in the 19th century, which is by the way kind of characteristic of modernity, in the 19th century there's a kind of changed and seemingly more like fraught relationship between, you know, the change and, you know, the and freedom and modernity, and then the question of like the eternal, the absolute. And, you know, there's a kind of, certainly in terms of modernism, in terms of like culture or the arts, there is this question of like how the two are to be related, and you know, the kind of meaning of change in modernity, how that becomes kind of fraught and kind of difficult to grasp and to articulate. And in a sense, there's a commonality there between Nietzsche and Marx, and that both are kind of taking up from different angles this kind of crisis of the meaning of freedom and of history and of historical change in the 19th century. And, you know, and those are both kind of you know, like bound up with
Okay, cool.
and we're back. Okay. So I'll just finish my point about modernism as like a category that might be useful. Yeah, so there's this kind of like fraught nature of like the 19th century, and, you know, I mean, obviously our kind of investigation into Marxism is, you know, inevitably kind of through the lens of its kind of later failure, and we have to try and make sense of Marxism through its kind of later failure. But there's also a sense in which that's true of like modernism more broadly, and you know, and it's the kind of attempt to relate and to make sense of these kind of you know, the kind of fragmentary and or like crisis-ridden nature of society in the 19th century. Like that's kind of part of Nietzsche. And you know, one thing that the kind of later reception of Marx is kind of that kind of characterizes the later reception of Marx is that it seems to kind of disintegrate into, you know, various like you know, like fragments that were kind of previously held together. And I think that's also kind of true of the postmodern reception of Nietzsche, that he's either taken as affirming the kind of apparently nihilistic character of change in the 19th century, or he's seen as a kind of reactionary critic of it. And of course, the point is like both and neither. There's a real kind of contradiction going on that Nietzsche is actually kind of trying to hold together in a certain way. And so, you know, I think the reception of Nietzsche via like, you know, Heidegger and the 20th century, you know, it is a real kind of symptom of, you know, the failure of, I mean, you know, Marxism, but also the kind of project of modernism altogether. And yeah, and so, you know, that's kind of I think that kind of speaks to like the way kind of one inevitably sees Nietzsche today as like some kind of angsty teenage mountain walker or something. But I'll leave it at that.
Victor, do you want to come in?
Or did Dom want to respond?
Oh, yeah.
I didn't respond. I'm a bit confused about who's responding to who at this point. I thought Tom, Ethan, Rory were kind of in a triangulation. But if not,
I mean, I can add something to that, because what I was going to say was very similar to what Rory just mentioned. To like, there's one useful reference I think that helped me understand all of this really well, which is Gillian Rose's Dialectics of Nihilism, where she shows how all of these, all of that reception of Nietzsche in the 20th century, as Rory said, takes him in a very one-sided way and ends up really, that their reading of Nietzsche is really symptomatic of their neo-Kantianism, and what they find in Nietzsche is really something like Kant, but they never really even get to Kant because of their refusal of the dialectic, and then because of their refusal of Hegel. So that was one thing. And then just also to clarify the question of nihilism, like the sorts of things. So of course, as I think was sort of clear in Dom's presentation, Nietzsche is a critic of nihilism, or is trying to make a diagnostic of what nihilism, the nihilism of his time, is about, rather than affirming nihilism. But the examples he gives, I thought were quite fascinating in the Genealogy of Morals. Schopenhauer's disgust at sex, at sexuality, wanting to save himself from sexual desire, and Wagner's also affirmation of virginity or celibacy or platonic love, right? And for him, that was nihilistic because it was the will to nothing, the will to what appears like a desire to extinguish the will is really still a will, but a will to nothing, which would still be better than the absence of a will. And that in their striving to overcome sexual desire, they are striving for something. And in reality, both of them are striving for the conditions that make philosophy and art possible, a certain retreat from the world and from the crowd and so on that makes it possible to think in the 19th century. A retreat from women and from mundanity and so on. But that retreat in itself does not have to be nihilistic. It's in that desire to justify that retreat and to affirm its necessity, that they become nihilistic. And that's the way, at least, I understood that in Nietzsche, which is really quite, of course, spectacularly similar to sort of stuff that Freud will say a little bit later, and what also, to continue on the connection with Marxism, what Wilhelm Reich also found in Freud, right? That is authoritarianism or fascism as precisely that desire to extinguish sexuality, but really as the oppression of a desire for freedom, right? The expression of an extremely intense desire for freedom that is necessarily negated by society in capitalism, and yet, and therefore manifests itself as a will to nothingness and to asceticism and prudishness, authoritarianism, mediocrity, that sort of stuff, right?
Can I say something about Nietzsche and postmodernism? What the 20th century gets from Nietzsche is anti-Marxism. That's the point. In other words, they just take Nietzsche to say this is why Marxism is wrong and that this is somehow going beyond it in that case. So what people, when they come to the Platypus reading group and they read Nietzsche, rediscover is that it never was like nihilism in like the most colloquial sense of nothing matters or something like that, because of course, as Nietzsche repeats again and again, nihilism is pointing beyond itself. It's a kind of self-mastery in that sense. And in a sense, you could say that, you know, what the proletariat is struggling to get at is a kind of self-mastery, right? They're trying to get behind, you know, their own self-struggle with themselves. So what, I don't know, Foucault gets from Nietzsche is this is why the Marxism around me is all wrong. And in fact, maybe Nietzsche didn't say the words Marxism, but they repeat the same problems, right? And the kernel of truth to that is the Marxism around him is reformism. And Nietzsche has a critique of reformism, right? This is the beyond good and evil. This is the, look, the socialist movement of my time is just this cult of mediocrity. And it's just about leveling things down. And not only that, it actually reflects the capitalism of my time. And reformism is, of course, the liquidation of the whole critical standpoint towards socialism, which that's actually what's behind the ruthless criticism of everything. It's not ruthless criticism in the colloquial sense of this is why everything is wrong, but rather what is the meaning of this? And so in that sense, Nietzsche has a ruthless criticism. It's not, you know, like, anyways, sorry.
Do you want to respond to that? Or we can bring comment.
Yeah, I don't understand it as a question. It's a comment. I think it's a very good one.
Right, Tom, you want to jump back in?
Or anyone else if they have anything to say.
I just wanted to. I think this sort of is continuing with the discussion, or it might be a tangent. Like one concept which I find very important in trying to understand Platypus is the concept of regression. And one concept that I find very important to try and understand Nietzsche is the one of eternal recurrence. And I'm wondering how we should articulate those two concepts. Are they connected? Are they opposite? Are they different, dialectically intertwined, or what is the connection, or is there one?
So I mentioned eternal recurrence, or I mentioned the ever same in the teaching with regards to critical history, in the sense that Marx kind of identified class struggle as something that was eternally the same, or exploitation. He kind of framed history as a problem of exploitation in the hope that this is what this is what we might change now by making the revolution. I don't necessarily think that's related to regression. I think when Platypus talks about regression, it's talking about either practical possibilities or kind of the consciousness of freedom in history, which was something that was, embodied in this kind of challenge of giving yourself a critical history and trying to, relate it or try and look for possibilities that the world could change with this history. So I think the eternally same, it's a matter of it's to what extent can we give ourselves an account of the eternally same is important, and I think perhaps that has regressed, the possibility of giving an account of it. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else has anything else to say about this. Danny says super historical.
Well, I was going to bring up that the reason why Benjamin looks to Nietzsche and the theses of philosophy of history is the question of breaking out of history altogether. And so, like, in a sense, in the use and abuse of history, which I had the pleasure of reading with some of you a few weeks ago, he goes through how history itself becomes historical as things develop, right? At first it's inspiring, it's kind of monumental, then it becomes sort of nihilistic. You brought up the antiquarian history, and then it raises this critical aspect of, maybe one is even like suffering from history of sorts, or one has a feeling of being a latecomer. So he ends the use and abuse of history by referencing ancient Greece with respect to Egypt and how it had to transform that sense. And so in a sense, he's getting at the critical character of regression, because regression is not just supposed to be like, this is why everything's bad. It's not supposed to be colloquial nihilism of just mourning, but rather how can you use the weight of history that feels burdensome to actually break through and change it. And actually, even the example he gives of ancient Greece and Egypt is maybe antediluvian, because it's not like, that's not regression in the way that Marx thinks of it, in terms of bourgeois society repeating the attempt, its own revolution, right? The 19th century repeats the 16th century. But rather that's what he looks to, because I guess that's his specialty and background in that sense.
Can I just make a couple of brief comments? I've got to dip in and out because I'm still quote unquote at work. And my kitchen is currently the House of Commons. I wanted to pad out a couple of things about kind of tying in a couple of different threads with respect to something you mentioned in the talk, which is utilitarianism. And I wanted to kind of pad that out as something which you didn't mention, which is liberalism. Because Nietzsche he's kind of responding to socialism, but he actually does that a bit less, but it does seem more kind of to the extent that the utilitarians, and again, it's a kind of late phase of utilitarianism rather than the early 19th century utilitarianism. It's maybe a kind of vulgar utilitarianism or something. Is a kind of liberalism politically. And he's kind of expressing discontent with that. But I'm always reminded of I mean, one thing to bring in there, for example, is Chris Catrone's article on Herbert Spencer, who is one of the kind of Englishmen who comes in for Nietzsche's ire directly. But Chris has this interesting article talking about the relationship between Herbert Spencer and Marx and this question of industrial society. But but I'm also minded of earlier 19th century figures who are seen when Nietzsche is kind of brought into the sphere of the right politically, he's sometimes seen in the lineage of someone like Thomas Carlyle, who has a kind of a kind of scathing critique of utilitarianism as not being about any human values, but being about kind of birth control, Malthusianism, telling people that they can have 2.6 children, and so you cut one child in half, kind of thing. And there's something there about how capitalism is kind of nihilistic, right? It has this, there's something about utilitarianism that's being kind of critiqued there, but it's done from a conservative Christian really position in the case of Carlyle. So maybe you could just, I thought it was interesting that you really picked up on the issue of utilitarianism, and maybe you could say something about that with respect to Nietzsche's relationship to liberalism, because I think in the way we receive Nietzsche via the New Left, one aspect is like postmodernism, but if you think about the people who we get the text from, the editors, people like Walter Kaufmann, there's a kind of like liberal Nietzsche reading in the 60s and 70s. And yeah, so I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think especially with the Darwinians and the genealogists, I did have in mind Herbert Spencer, perhaps as a utilitarian too. Is that perhaps, I actually don't know what Bentham was writing. Would you consider him one of the earlier, more sophisticated utilitarians? Right. I hope I'm getting at this the right way, but maybe a comment I would say is that kind of the ideological problem I was trying to get at in the latter part of my teaching, in which kind of history looms over the present and death looms over life, etc. But in the way that it appears to, in the way that capital appears to loom over labor and determine labor, not determine the subject. It's an appearance, but it's also real. It's how society is really constituted. So this kind of antiquarian, not to draw too close an analogy, but this kind of antiquarian or scientific understanding of society really is how society is produced as well. In a kind of utilitarian fashion. It reminds me of Marx's address to the Working Men's Committee, where he's talking about the the agent from Parliament who's calculating how much nitrogen different communities need. Liberalism, I guess, or this kind of late liberalism in capitalism, doesn't really. Its concern is the kind of scientific management of people, and I suppose that's related to the massification of society in capitalism that I tried to bring up. I think that's about all I can say. I'm not sure if that gets to what you wanted me to.
Yeah, no, sorry, there wasn't really a kind of specific question in what I said, but I guess I wanted to get at this. The talk was kind of framed around why, in some ways, like why wasn't Nietzsche a socialist? And there's the other question, which is why wasn't Nietzsche like a liberal politically, or what would that have meant? Because obviously he's the main way he's read is just as a retreat from politics altogether. So I was trying to kind of bring in some different historical aspects of the crisis of liberalism, and also the idea that maybe in the New Left there was also a liberal recovery of Nietzsche, or maybe like slightly earlier than the Foucauldian stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
I think actually this is interesting, and it does come out in his not explicit, but it's anti-nationalism, and his kind of frustration with his you know, his buddy Wagner, because when he was younger, of course, he was good friends with the composer, but they fell out for numerous reasons, and I do believe a great part of the disagreement was on anti-Semitism. And what I tried to draw attention also to at the beginning of the talk was how formative, you know, the Franco-Prussian War was in Nietzsche's life, and, you know, Bismarck and the authoritarian state. And there is this sense of, you know, he kind of resents the fact that, you know, Germany's the big deal, and not, you know, not Europe or something, or not perhaps not a cosmopolitan community, you know, of free peoples or whatever, not bourgeois society, but Germany, you know, the state, and, you know, kind of a narrow-minded sense of being German, as opposed to being a, you know, European. So perhaps, you know, in that way, you could see him as, you know, an older liberal, like a kind of bourgeois, cosmopolitan point of view liberal, living in this time in which, you know, different nations have become, you know, under the remit of authoritarian states, which are warring with each other, France and Germany, Franco-Prussian War. And Nietzsche's definitely, you know, frustrated and bothered by this quite a lot. Yeah. I can't speak to the New Left readings of Nietzsche particularly. I don't know if anyone else wants to speak about this.
I mean, maybe I think maybe what Ephraim's sort of getting at is Nietzsche is kind of holding on to something in liberalism that, like, actually existing liberalism had abandoned, and so having a kind of you know, and that being to do with why in the New Left, or in the New Left kind of moment, there's a reaching back to Nietzsche by liberals, because, you know, because there is like a crisis, because liberalism by the mid 20th century has become absolutely about, you know, the state management of society, and you know, progressivism, right? And I don't know, I'm kind of speculating a bit here too, but this, you know, that kind of going into crisis in the 50s and 60s and 70s maybe leading to a kind of you know, the kind of haunting guilty conscience of what liberalism has abandoned being kind of reached back to in the form of Nietzsche.
And what specifically would you say he feels that has been abandoned? I think I tried to get at that with the, you know, the kind of cosmopolitanism. Perhaps, you know, the division in the teaching I tried to give was between, you know, the early bourgeois radicals like Adam Smith and Kant and Hegel, and then of course Nietzsche, who's writing in the mid to late 19th century with authoritarian states and you know, capitalism. So the only thing I can think of here is kind of the cosmopolitanism, and perhaps the kind of, you know, the failure to come, you know, for the promises to come to fruition. But
I mean, maybe just the project of freedom.
I think Dom's absolutely right to pinpoint the question of like Germany after 1871. But you know, just a kind of obvious way of thinking about it, and this is maybe more a direct question, is that the dividing line over whether one was quote unquote a liberal in the 19th century was, where do you stand on the French Revolution of the 18th century? Where did Nietzsche stand on the French Revolution of the 18th century?
That's interesting, and he does talk about it. I can't actually. I believe it is in the on the genealogy of morals. If not, it's in on the use and abuse of history for life. But he's very ambivalent about it, in the sense that he sees it as the herd. He sees it as, you know, resentment, and he sees it as revenge. On the one part, on the part of the masses who, you know, need to clamber together. He sees it as, you know, a kind of another slave revolt. But he also says, kind of within this coming together of, slaves and revolt, there was also the emergence of, perhaps the more ancient ideal of strength. I think he says, amongst the slave value of the supreme rights of the majority, came forth again this this genuinely remarkable and enviable kind of value of the supreme rights of the individual or the strong. And I think he kind of saw this in the character of Napoleon. And what's kind of funny about it is, it sounds like, again, in the way that he's often misread, that he's kind of being very romantic. Perhaps he is romantic, but in the way that it reads as if he wants there to be the kind of warrior aristocracy. It might read as though he's saying that Napoleon is a warrior aristocrat, but I think he's just saying that perhaps there is something about what happened in the French Revolution that is interesting, and that might be new and might be to do with freedom, and it's the ability of the individual to go alone and to be free. I don't know, that's probably a really bad reading, but
I might add just one thing, that in Platypus we have a way of talking about the birth of bourgeois society, overcoming or breaking with traditional society. We talk about it as humanity first stumbling upon a consciousness of itself and coming to an understanding that it has a power to sort of change the way things are. Just the pithy way of summing it up is, Thomas Paine's talking about how we have it within ourselves to begin the world anew, that kind of language. And I think both in the genealogy on morality and in the truth and lies in a extra moral sense, Nietzsche talks about how we have creative powers, and that's where our artistic ability is greatest as humans, is we can be conscious of our power. We can be an artistically creative subject, and the problem is that we've forgotten that. We've sort of reified our existence, and we've sort of started to treat things as happening independent of us. And that's, I guess, what he thinks is the crisis that we've fallen into, is we've started to treat things as if, they happen independent of us.
I'll just read out what Victor has posted in the chat in relation to what I was just saying about Napoleon. Apparently, Nietzsche called Napoleon a strange hybrid of a brute and a Superman. I think Victor comments that he embodies the contradiction of the French Revolution. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that.
Yeah, I didn't want to make a big deal of it, just to complement what you were saying, because that's indeed where and I still can't remember in what text that is, but because a great thing about Napoleon is that he's a nobody, right? He becomes the sort of spirit of the world on a horse, but he's not a noble man. He's, he's not even French, right? He's from Corsica, which is really brutish, especially in the 18th century, right? Sort of Italian, but not really, it's savage. And so he is like the brute and at the same time the Superman all at once. And I think that shows, I think the point is that the potential of the revolution hasn't been made good, and therefore it looks still like this resentment-fueled slave revolt at the same time as it was the realization of freedom in the world, right? And because it leads to this, herd society and herd mentality that at the same time had proclaimed the rights of the individual and so on, it is through and through contradictory. And as Rory was saying, as you've been saying too, right, afterwards, it's read in the 20th century either as an affirmation of the individual or as a critique, or one-sidedly, right, as a celebration of freedom, or as an affirmation of nihilism and of the hopelessness of the herd. But Nietzsche wasn't really doing this. I was thinking, like, there's a very weak but interesting reception of Nietzsche in France around a guy called Jacques Bouvresse, who's very much like the guy who imported logical positivism in France, or like analytic philosophy. And so you wouldn't expect him to like Nietzsche or to even read Nietzsche. And he puts Nietzsche alongside Musil and Karl Kraus, right? He's really fascinated by these three figures as precisely critiques of the herd mentality, of opinion, of the news, right, of the media, and so on. And yet that don't produce a revolutionary movement or whatever, but just a sort of stern and clear-sighted critique of herd mentality. And for him, as far as I understand it, it's what he sees in Nietzsche actually is a critique of the New Left and of the New Left's herd mentality and sort of authoritarianism that he had to live through. So he's from the same generation as Foucault and all of this. And he was basically bullied by all these guys. And so Nietzsche, Musil, and Karl Kraus offered him this sort of a possibility for the continuation of public reason, I guess, which is also what he thought he was finding in Wittgenstein and in logical positivism, right? The possibility of reason beyond, bullying or the herd mentality.
Tom's had his hand up for a while, so I wanted to kind of bring Tom Cannell back in. If you still have more questions or comments, Tom.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about the connection between freedom and necessity, and because it seems to me, it's obviously very important, like in terms of Marxism, and Hegel, I wonder whether it is equally important, and if it's important in the same way with respect to Nietzsche.
This is pretty philosophical. I know this is kind of a thing that goes back to Kant. It's kind of the antinomy of freedom and necessity. And as you said, obviously also in Hegel and Marx. How does this stand in relation to Nietzsche? I don't know. I don't think he necessarily treats that as an antinomy, or at least not explicitly in the way that Marx did. And for instance, or like Rosa Luxemburg, you know, I think at least LSE chapter recently read the Junius pamphlet. Rosa's like, on the one hand, she's like, the choice is now. Then she's like, there are iron necessities that we're dealing with. She's like absolutely dealing with that dialectical problem. Nietzsche, it doesn't strike me that I can't think of any explicit dealings with it. Generally, and in terms of antinomies in Nietzsche, again, he's not very explicit with them. What I tried to emphasize in the teaching was, you know, the way he's immanent in the way that Marx is, and in the way that he believes that he's trying to hold contradictions together within objects, in the hope that they will, you know, come apart productively or produce something beyond themselves. You know, for instance, with the antiquarian history, he thinks that you know, people will find it so intolerable to feel history weighing on them to the degree that it does, that they will be forced to feel the need to destroy it and to condemn it with critical history. So there is this sense of a kind of, you know, an imminent self-overcoming. Yeah, I was also going to say something about the you know, the genealogists. So in a way, there is kind of a contradiction in that they're willing nothingness. You know, they are striving after nothing but the facts and trying to remove the consideration of the subject and the interested gatherer of the facts. And you know, Nietzsche, of course, ends the book by saying, you know, it's fine, but people would rather will nothingness than not will at all. You know, there is a self-contradiction there between, you know, on the one hand, nothingness, and on the other hand, the human desiring and striving. And he thinks that that's kind of a contradiction that will, as I said, like burst asunder, I think. But I don't really know what to say about freedom and necessity in Nietzsche. I know someone just.
That was really useful. Thank you.
I think actually, Dom, you did talk quite well about this question in Nietzsche when you discussed the relationship to Darwinism, right? That is, Darwinism presents itself precisely as a play of as a mechanical product of pure necessity. And yet Nietzsche doesn't deny it. He doesn't say, no, that's not true. Darwin is wrong. He says at the same time, what they don't see in this is that it is freedom, right? It is the will to power that expresses itself. And so at the same time as it can look like a pure mechanical progress, it is through and through the expression of a will to power. But that at the same time, as you just mentioned, the fact that they cannot see this, that they deny that aspect, is a symptom of the crisis of modernity, right, of nihilism. And I think over the summer we read Kautsky, and I can't remember in what text of Kautsky that's also made very clear. He has these 2 pages sort of straight out of Nietzsche, where he says, precisely, and it's precisely when he's trying to discuss the question of necessity and action in Marxism, and of the prophetic accusation, right? The accusation, the one hand, the accusation that Marxism is prophetic, and on the other hand, the demand that it should be prophetic, that it should tell us when to act. And very surprisingly, he says, and the third element in that same thing, the accusation of that Marxism is mechanical, right, and that it denies subjectivity. And very surprisingly, at that moment, Kautsky goes precisely for evolution, and he says evolution was propelled by the will to live, and in human history it becomes the will to live better. And that's the basis that's freedom, right? That's the expression of freedom, and that's basically like, and that doesn't mean that evolution wasn't what scientists say it is. Right? There's no anti-scientism in this, but rather both are part of the same thing, right?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about how that I didn't want to read Nietzsche as providing like an alternative theory of evolution. Although I did love the things he was writing, I understand it's just a different emphasis, and he thinks this emphasis is important because, of course, to emphasize, you know, just the external circumstance happening to life, you know, it does obscure the will to power, it does obscure freedom, and as you said, like the subject. Yeah.
And it's not anti-scientific or non-scientific. My friends who are biologists or who work with environmental biologists are very intent on precisely that sort of point, that animals play, that animals are like, they do all sorts of goofy stuff that is not like, they're not purely utilitarian machines, right? It's sort of, and of course, anyone who's lived near an animal knows that, right? Animals are just, and when they're horny, you know, they're like that will to power, or when they murder other animals, right? When they kill, when they're hungry, but the cruel pleasure of a cat when it plays with a mouse is, you know, goes beyond pure utilitarianism, and the difference between play and the need to eat, like play and hunger, and the sadistic pleasure in the pain of the animals that it's persecuting, that sort of stuff, right? It's a part of that same thing. You might want or need methodologically to put it aside when you're describing certain biological phenomena, but it doesn't mean that it's that you have to actually deny their existence, right? Scientists are scientists, but that doesn't mean that they do not recognize the reality of these phenomena.
I was actually going to put in the event description as a video of the mud skipper fish. It's decided that life on land is more nourishing than, you know, its chances in water, and it's, you know, it's obviously put a fin to use as a leg in a way that's kind of absurd. It looks ridiculous, but it's managed to do it because it's desired to do so. Not because it's been forced out the water, but because it's found something more nourishing about the mud. I thought that was a good kind of example of the will to power and evolution, but I didn't want to get too sidetracked with the biology, I guess.
I don't know if you mentioned this because I had to just dip out again, but one of my favorite parts in on the genealogy of morals is where he makes the analogy between the discovery of self-consciousness in the slave revolt of morality with the amoeba first feeling gravity when it comes out of the water. That's like one bit that's always stuck with me.
Yeah, and that does raise part of the book that I avoided in the slave revolt of morality. I'm not sure if I should go into it or not. It would only be useful if people would, you know, were reading it and perhaps wanted a pointer. But Nietzsche thinks that, and I guess this is an example of why Nietzsche doesn't want us to go back to, you know, kind of the warrior aristocrats. He, in this way, you know, he's very provocative, and he wants us to kind of come to face our slave moralism. So he's very rude about it. But he ultimately thinks that, you know, when we revolted as slaves, and, you know, when society became slave-like and resentful, you know, this is when we became, quote, like a truly interesting animal, because we looked inwards, and we divided up the deed from the intention. So we kind of treat our souls as something different from what we do, and this is kind of like the origin of, like, you know, kind of monotheism and Christianity. And yeah,
it's a very important point as well for Rousseau, right? I mean, that's where he's like really Rousseauian, and that's where the dialectic actually emerges in a kind of self-consciousness, in mutual self-consciousness in society, and, you know, being able to reflect on and change your practice because you experience yourself as not identical with it in a certain way. Yeah, and the other thing I just add to that is that's obviously also very important for what Freud inherits from Nietzsche, particularly in Civilization and its discontents, of a kind of turning inward against oneself certain drives, and that this like inflicts great pain on ourselves, but that's also produces for the first time the capacity for transforming the kind of the meaning of that that pain, and having self-consciousness.
It's also all it's Rousseauian, and the same way that Rousseau says, you know, when you look at other people with that sense of vanity, it's for the first time you start to compare what you are like versus what you could be, like the is-ought question. And Nietzsche has that too with we start to turn inwards because, you know, we're self-punishing animal. And we, you know, how could we be better? How could we be different? I think it's all very Hegelian too, where he's basically saying the process of conscience formation and the ascetic practices that we've done and the slave revolt morality, what was it all for? You know, we could bemoan it and we could say we're no longer the great brutes, we no longer have the master morality, or we could tell a sort of affirmative story of, you know, it's better to be slaves anyway. Or we could ask the question, you know, what was the potential it pointed to? It was a bloody transition, he says over and over again, but what was it for? Like the slaughterhouse of history, Hegel will ask, you know, what was it all for? Nietzsche has that same kind of question.
I actually have a really basic question, and it's really late for this question. But could you explain like slave morality a bit more? Because I think maybe that's kind of taken for granted on what I mean.
I tried to explain it in the teaching as just good and evil. It's the kind of valuation that you know, there is good and evil, because in an ancient warrior society, you know, if you were strong and healthy and you rode your horse and into battle and slayed people, what was good was just your health and your happiness, and you know, all of your activities would be lively. You would joust or something, you would fight in your spare time. Everything was about health and enjoyment, revelry, courting, whatever. What is good is the things that give you, you know, enjoyment and strength. And what is bad is everything that inhibits that strength. But of course, if you're a slave, or if you're a slave people, things are a bit different, and because you're the prey to these warrior aristocrats, and you're less healthy. Your lifestyle is not conducive to health. You're like a laborer, you're a toiler, your nutrition's poor, whatever. So you know, you're not healthy and happy. You're not revelry. You know, you're working. So it doesn't have a valuation of what's good, really. First of all, it only knows what's evil. And as I said, in this new evaluation of what's evil, it's comprised of everything that was once good, because these slaves hate the brutes, because the brutes brutalize them and subject them and stand over them. So the slave morality is this kind of inversion of the original valuation of good and bad, in which everything that was once great is now evil. But there is a kind of other aspect to it. As I tried to say, that Nietzsche's insight is that to suffer in the face of meaningless is intolerable. And of course, like if you're healthy and brilliant and you're a warrior, you're not really suffering all that much. But if you're a slave and you're in pain, you're suffering a great deal, and you're looking for a reason why. And of course, it's quite dangerous, because you might look, of course, to another person, and that's not very healthy for society. So then, of course, you have a priest who comes in and kind of saves the day and says, you know, the reason why you're suffering is yourself. Look within. And this is a kind of way to, as Ephraim mentioned, kind of very, very Freudian, of like rather Freud is Nietzschean, but this is the idea that you channel your hatred and resentment inwards. You're told to know thyself, and you know, everything bad that is happening to you is happening because you have not been faithful, or you are not, you're not holy, you're not good, or you might be letting your evil instincts get the better of you, you know, your desire to be strong, even. So that's what slave morality is. Ressentiment is quite important. I think Victor wants to say something.
No, just to add one last bit that's also part of this, which is that others, it might look like others are persecuting you, like they're the reasons for your unhappiness, but really you like God is sending you, you know, some sort of struggle because you've sinned, or to test whether you will sin, and he will deal with them, right? The ones who look like they're powerful and they're rich and they're hurting you, like God will deal with them, and you shouldn't do that. What you should do is work on yourself. And what that made me think was the way, actually listening to Ephraim's debate with, like on Mark Fisher. You know, Mark Fisher is also really popular because his mental illness is really the product of capitalism. And there's a sense in which, you know, recently everything, you know, mental health, every sort of mental health problem and every problem that you have is really the cause of microaggressions and attacks by other people. That's the way sort of leftists tend to think about that stuff. And therefore you have to attack the white people that are the cause of your poverty. And you have, you know, it's like this purely outwards facing thing, as opposed to this, like what becomes unbearable is the idea that the working class might be the cause of its own suffering, right? And that also individually, like perhaps, like sure, other people will attack you, but maybe like your mental health is like sort of your problem. And as opposed to like lashing out, like work on yourself in this very Freudian way. I don't know if that was very clear because it's a bit late, but you know, there's a way in which we've regressed in relation to asceticism and to that sort of slave morality, like that brutalization of society and that barbarism in which we live expresses itself in the left as this very progressive, apparently subtle analysis of this ill pleasure or unhappiness as being the product of external forces, and calling for aggression of these external forces, rather than, and so that we might wish people were a bit more evangelical about all of that stuff, you know, evangelical Christians working on their own salvation. Yeah.
It's also very much related to Jordan Peterson, if we want to get into that, who of course says, you know, drop the politics and go clean your room, because you can't change the world until your room's tidy. That's like, it's kind of a metaphor for the same thing. Work on yourself, work on your psychology. Because of course, like Jordan Peterson is responding to exactly that kind of, you know, his own campus. He's responding to youth movements, identity politics on campus. And he thinks he's doing them, you know, a great favor by saying, you know, what will help you is, you know, taking responsibility for yourself. So he's almost being a priest here. But he's a terrible reader of Nietzsche, all in all. Especially, I mean, I don't know, this is something we talked about in Victor's reading group, is of course the Zizek-Nietzsche debate, in which Peterson, what am I saying? Zizek-Nietzsche, sorry, Peterson debated Zizek a couple of years ago, and Peterson had a reading of the Communist Manifesto that was very Nietzschean. It was basically very flatly saying, you know, Marx wants the proletariat to take power because the proletariat are good and the bourgeoisie are bad, and the good must overcome the bad, and we must, you know, he basically thinks it's a slave revolt, and he's kind of right in that sense, but he does miss, you know, that Marx perhaps anticipates this, or, you know, he doesn't think that's all there is to a socialist revolution. Marx does think it points beyond that, in its, you know, in its pursuit of this contradiction of labor. But yeah, there is this Nietzschean aspect of Peterson, Jordan Peterson.
Right, and that's, as you say, it's sort of paradoxical. He thinks he's being Nietzschean, but really he is the priest that Nietzsche doesn't affirm, right? And it's kind of sad that this is what's needed in a way, you know, that flocks of young people pay for Jordan Peterson to be addicted to tranquilizers because there's no one else that tells them like clean your room and work on yourself and pay attention to your internal life a little bit. Like it's not just, don't just lash out. These very simple, then even evangelicals are not able to do this anymore, right? The evangelicals did this for the hippie generation in a lot of ways, and yet even they have been sort of dismissed. Like, I guess, like radical Islam is that also for a lot of young people. And like, if you look at all the French terrorists, I'm sorry, we're going on a tangent, but if you look at all the like French terrorists from like 2015 and all of that, all of them have this very sort of evangelical story where they used to be addicted to porn and smoke weed and do a lot of drugs, and then they discover Islam and they sort of start working on themselves and becoming serious, and women are quite instrumental in this and making them like be serious about themselves and their salvation, and this is how they end up like also lashing out. But you know, there's this
yeah, I think in that example, it's definitely not the case that it's a turn inwards. That's definitely the barbarism.
Well,
if it's terrorism.
I mean, it's used. It's ultimately right. They're sort of used to barbaric ends, but it is fueled by the same nihilistic desire for an end of desire that also fulfills them through these really intense states in prayer and so on. And but I mean, certainly it is barbaric through and through, right? But that's in the same way that like the Jordan Peterson bullshit is barbaric through and through. But there's a need for that, and it does express I guess what's left of slave morality today, the good and the bad. I don't know.
So maybe to make the connection, it's, you know, slave morality and pre-modernity gave kind of meaning, right? Actually, slave morality within modernity becomes nihilistic, right? Because there's a dissociation between, you know, the like, meaningful practice, or just like societal conception of meaning, I guess, right? Like in modernity, you can adopt Jordan Peterson's 12 rules for life, or you can adopt, you know, convert to like Mormonism, right? And practice, you know, whatever Mormons think. In modernity, actually fails to make sense, right? And like the structure of society, like even a pious kind of asceticism fails to that's a kind of fulfillment that would have otherwise been answered in pre-modern times.
Right, but Nietzsche's point is also that it's a way to avoid suffering still. Like the reason why, you know, the moderns are ascetic is because we can't handle the fact that there is meaninglessness. So we try to shut it out as a question and do the good work. You know, we gather our facts, we do our experiments, and we gather our data. We don't, you know. Sorry, I'm focusing too much on science, literally science. I don't think he means that.
Well, it's also like sociology and history, right?
Sociology and history, especially.
Yeah, that's what comes to my mind. Right, it's like meaningless kind of data. In the end,
like the thing that brings to mind the sort of figure that I think exemplifies the way it's both, like the scientist and the mystic. I don't know if you read Submission by Welbeck, but Submission by Welbeck is really great, sort of mise en abîme of all this. But you have this really funny character at the end of the 19th century, a French novelist, Huysmans, who is a naturalist. I mean, Zola is already that, if you want, actually. Zola is this naturalist writer who thinks he's a scientist. He like imports science into art, right? He wants to be a scientific novelist that goes out and he looks at how people live, and like his books are almost like ethnographic novels, but beyond this, he even thinks they're like biological texts. Like he looks at biological determination of character in one family and the sort of transmission of mental illness in a certain way. But then when you read these like supposedly naturalistic descriptions, it's full of completely grotesque, intense fabulations. And one of Zola's disciples, Huysmans, brings that a lot more intensely, where he starts this, his first novel is about like satanic cults in Paris. And then he becomes himself, he converts to Catholicism and writes these like really entranced novels about like Notre Dame de Paris and like even the architecture and all of it. But the more you read his novels and the more you realize that he really wants to believe. He really wants to believe. But most of all, he really likes the art. You know, he likes the paintings, he likes the sculptures, he really likes food. And most of the novels are like him trying to be a Christian, but really him mostly enjoying the aesthetics of it, you know. But you have the same like desire to extinguish desire, and that produces an intensification of hallucinatory states that Nietzsche describes in like as the product of asceticism. And then Welbeck's novel Submission is about a specialist of Huysmans, today an academic, who cannot even get hard anymore, tries desperately to find like a prostitute that would turn him on, but it doesn't really work. And he's completely disinterested in anything, even his job. And at the same time, this left-wing Muslim guy gets elected president of France. And he doesn't really care. Like all of his colleagues pretend they care, but very rapidly everybody's quite happy because if you're an academic, they give you like a second wife to cook and a third wife to have sex, and like things are actually quite cozy. And there's a sort of like a full, like he identifies with Huysmans because he would also almost like to be persuaded by Islam. You know, he'd almost
He's gone.
the sort of ultimate nihilistic, you know, a really great expression of that regression in that 100 years. And of course, when it came out, which was just after the terrorist attacks in Paris, it was an absolute scandal because he was called Islamophobic, and like, which perhaps was a way it read at the time, you know, if you read it in the moment. But if you read it now, it's a really enjoyable novel. And if you read Huysmans, it's also very enjoyable. But the two often go hand in hand. There's another thing actually on this. There's a saying in Brazil, I forget what it's, the exact phrasing of it, but French people, when they go to Brazil, they're like the most rationalistic people. They're like anti-religion. They hate the evangelicals and whatever. And then they go to a candomblé session, which is like Afro-Brazilian cults, a possession cult. And they go there as tourists, and they're the first to get possessed by a spirit. You know, they go and then suddenly, right? And like some sort of Congo spirit from the 15th century, like speaks through their mouths and tell people what to do, and they, you know, spit rum and all of that. And that's very much like, I think what Nietzsche's about, or that what looks like a contradiction between the two, but really is just a product of nihilism and scientific asceticism, as well as religious asceticism, being very much of the same ilk.
So we've just gone past like the 2-hour marker. So I feel that we should maybe wrap it up. If you have any maybe last things to say.
I have nothing final to say other than thank you for everyone who's come along. I don't know if anyone else wants to make any comments.
I think we're good. I'm gonna make the intervention
Okay.
and wrap it up. Yes,
Great,
thank you everyone
thank you.
for coming, and especially thank you, Dom. Maybe we can do a virtual round of applause.
Thanks, Dom.
The little emoji.
Thanks, Dom.
Yes, okay. So we think that we'll upload this to the Platypus YouTube channel. So keep an eye out for that. Again, if you have any questions or are interested in the organization, platypus1917.org, or find us on Facebook, so the LSE Platypus page, or just like the Platypus Reader Facebook page. Thank you everyone for coming, and we wish you a good day wherever you are.
Good day, everyone. Good night.
Bye.